The air in the parts department of the Greene County John Deere dealership hung thick and heavy, a sterile mix of new rubber, fresh paint, and the faint, cloying scent of pine-scented floor cleaner. It was the smell of money, of progress, and to Silas Blackwood it smelled all wrong. He stood at the counter, his knuckles white where he gripped the busted magnetocap from his old Farmall M. The plastic was cracked clean through, a spiderweb of fissures radiating from the number 3 terminal. Across the counter, Chet Miller, a kid barely 25 with a haircut that cost more than Silas's work boots, squinted at the part like it was a fossil from a bygone age. He tapped it with a pen. "A Farmall, you said?" "An M?" "That's what I said," Silas replied, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate from the worn denim of his overalls. Chet let out a short, dismissive laugh. He turned to the other man standing at the counter, a big, fleshy farmer named Frank Gable, whose new green and yellow cap sat perched on a head of sweat-damp hair. "Hear that, Frank? A Farmall M. My grandpa had one of those." Frank Gable grinned, a wide, confident expression that showed a gold tooth. "Yeah, so did mine. Parked it in the trees back in '68 when I bought my first 40-20. Best thing he ever did." Frank gestured with a thick thumb toward the showroom floor, where a brand-new John Deere 430 stood gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Its tires were taller than Silas, the glass of its sound guard cab a dark, impenetrable fortress. "That's a real tractor, Silas. Time to join the 20th century, old man." Silas's jaw tightened. He ignored Frank and focused on the smirking parts man. "Can you get the part or not, son?" Chet tapped a few keys on his clunky computer terminal, a newfangled contraption the dealership was mighty proud of. He shook his head slowly, a look of theatrical pity on his face. "Nope, nothing. We don't carry parts for museum pieces. Maybe try a junkyard." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Look, Mr. Blackwood, let me be straight with you. Keeping that old thing running, you're just throwing good money after bad. We can get you into that 40 or 30 out there for a reasonable down payment. The bank's loaning money hand over fist right now. With what corn prices are doing, it'll pay for itself in 2 seasons." Silas slowly pulled the broken magnetocap back across the counter. His hands, stained with the grease and soil of 30 years of farming, dwarfed the small piece of plastic. He'd rebuilt the engine on that M twice. He knew the precise torque for every head bolt, the exact feel of the hand clutch engaging, the particular growl the C248 engine made when it bit into the heavy clay soil on the back 40. That tractor wasn't just a machine, it was an extension of his own muscle and bone. It owed him nothing, and he owed it nothing. They were square. "The bank," Silas said, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. "The bank doesn't own a single acre of my land, son. And it's not about to start owning my tractor, either." Frank Gable let out a loud guffaw. "Still plowing with 2 bottoms, Silas? I just bought another 80 acres from old man Hemlock. Gonna run my new 20-foot disc over it tomorrow. Be done in an afternoon. How long would that take you with your little red toy?" "It'll take as long as it takes," Silas said, his eyes like chips of granite. "And when it's done, it'll be mine. The crop, the land, the tractor that planted it. All of it." Chet just shook his head, a final gesture of condescension. "You're a fool, Mr. Blackwood. A stubborn old fool. This is the 1970s. You gotta get big or get out. You can't farm a quarter section with a 30-year-old tractor and expect to survive." Silas didn't say another word. He simply turned and walked out, the broken part clutched in his fist. The automatic glass doors hissed shut behind him, sealing him out of their world of easy credit and disposable iron. He stepped into the blinding afternoon sun, the smell of diesel exhaust from the new tractors in the lot stinging his nostrils. He could still hear Frank Gable's booming laughter behind him. A fool. The word echoed in the quiet cab of his old Chevy pickup as he rumbled down the gravel road, away from the glittering green and yellow promises of the dealership. He was heading home, to the one place where that word didn't mean a thing. Before we go any further into this story, I have to ask you something. When you think about a real farmer, a real man of the soil, what do you see? Do you see the guy like Frank Gable, taking the risk, borrowing big to get the latest and greatest machine that can do the work of 3 men? Or do you see the man like Silas, who trusts only the iron he can pay for with cash and fix with his own 2 hands? Let me know down in the comments which man you think has the right idea, because the answer to that question is the heart of this whole story. The drive back to his farm was a straight shot down County Road G. On his right, Frank Gable's land began, a vast, unbroken sea of black dirt stretching to the horizon. You could see the path of his new disc, wide as a highway, the soil turned over in perfect uniform ribbons. Gable had torn out 3 fence rows that spring, combining smaller fields into one massive one to accommodate his big equipment. The birds didn't sing there anymore. There was nowhere for them to land. Silas's place appeared on the left, a stark contrast. A modest white farmhouse with a green tin roof, a big red barn whose paint was starting to peel, and a handful of smaller outbuildings, all nestled in a grove of ancient oak trees. His fields were smaller, bordered by the thick, tangled fence rows his father and grandfather had maintained. They were a haven for quail and rabbits, but a headache for modern farming. To men like Gable, they were wasted space. To Silas, they were the farm's punctuation, the seams that held it all together. He parked the Chevy next to the machine shed, the gravel crunching under the tires. The doors of the shed stood open, and inside, his Farmall M waited, its red paint faded to a dull orange, its front tires pointing slightly askew. It looked tired, a patient old workhorse waiting for a cure. He walked over to it, running a hand along the warm hood. He could feel the faint vibrations of the engine cooling, the ticking and popping of contracting metal. He didn't need Chet Miller or his fancy computer. He had a better source. He walked into the workshop, a space that smelled of motor oil, welding flux, and damp earth. Against the far wall stood a stack of old coffee cans, each one labeled in his father's careful, spidrilling script. Ford A10 carburetor parts, Alice Chalmers WC bolts, and the one he was looking for, Farmall M ignition. He pried the lid off with a screwdriver. Inside was a tangled nest of old wires, worn-out points, condensers, and at the very bottom, 2 used magneto caps. One was in worse shape than the one in his hand. But the other was intact. It was grimy, the brass terminals green with corrosion. But it wasn't cracked. Hope, small but sturdy, bloomed in his chest. For the next 3 hours, Silas worked. He wasn't a mechanic by trade, but he was a farmer, which meant he was a mechanic by necessity. He cleaned the old cap first, using a small wire brush and a rag soaked in gasoline until the brass terminals shone like new pennies. He checked it for hairline cracks against the light, finding none. Satisfied, he turned his attention to the magneto itself. With a delicacy that seemed at odds with his calloused hands, he removed the 2 screws holding the magneto to the engine block. He laid it carefully on his workbench, the greasy metal cool against the scarred wood. He used a feeler gauge, a thin strip of metal no thicker than a sheet of paper, to set the gap on the points, adjusting the tiny screw until the gauge slid through with just the slightest drag. Point gap was everything. Too wide, and the spark would be weak. Too narrow, and the points would burn up. It had to be perfect. He replaced the condenser, a small metal cylinder that stored and released the electrical charge, pulling a new one from a dusty box on the shelf. He carefully scraped the corrosion from the end of each spark plug wire before seating them firmly in the terminals of the cleaned-up cap. He could feel the satisfying click as each one snapped into place. Finally, he bolted the magneto back onto the engine. Now came the tricky part: timing. He pulled the number 1 spark plug and put his thumb over the hole. Using the hand crank that jutted out from the front of the tractor, he slowly, painstakingly turned the engine over. He felt for the rush of air against his thumb that signaled the compression stroke. Then he peered through the small timing hole in the bell housing, looking for the tiny mark on the flywheel to line up with the pointer. When it was perfectly aligned, he rotated the magneto housing just a hair until he heard the faint, sharp snap of the points opening. That was it. That was the spark. He put the plug back in, tightened it with a wrench, and climbed into the worn metal seat. The seat pan was cracked, and the spring had long since lost its bounce, but it fit him like a glove. He pulled the throttle down a quarter of the way, checked that the gear shift was in neutral, and pulled the starter rod. The starter motor groaned, a low, guttural sound. The big engine turned over once, twice, then a third time. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Silas felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. Had he missed something? Was the coil bad? Then, with a loud bark that echoed off the tin walls of the shed, the M fired. A puff of blue smoke erupted from the vertical exhaust stack, and the engine settled into a lumpy, uneven idle. It coughed and sputtered. Silas reached down and adjusted the carburetor's main jet screw, turning it a quarter turn in. The rhythm smoothed out. The loping idle became a steady, confident thrum, a sound he knew as well as his own heartbeat. Each cylinder was firing in perfect sequence now. He nudged the throttle, and the engine roared to life, the deep, throaty song of good old American iron filling the shed. A slow smile spread across his face. Let Chet Miller keep his computers and his easy credit. Silas Blackwood had his hands, his wits, and a can full of forgotten parts. For now, it was enough. The rest of that planting season was a brutal affair. The spring was wet, turning the fields into a thick, greasy mud that tried to suck the boots right off his feet. When it finally dried out enough to work, Silas was days behind everyone else. Every morning, he'd see the plume of diesel smoke from Frank Gable's 4430 on the horizon, long before the sun was fully up. By the time Silas finished his coffee and got the M started, Gable would have 20 acres planted. It was a slow, lonely grind. The M pulled a 4-row John Deere planter, an old plate-type model he'd bought at an auction years ago. He'd sit on that iron seat for 10 hours a day, the sun beating down on his neck, the engine's roar a constant companion. There was no air-conditioned cab, no radio, just the rhythmic clank of the planter units dropping seed into the furrow and the feel of the steering wheel vibrating in his hands. He'd watch the birds swoop down to pick worms from the freshly turned earth in his wake. He'd stop for lunch under the shade of a fence-row oak, eating a sandwich his wife, Martha, had packed for him, drinking lukewarm water from a thermos. The talk at the co-op was all about yields and expansion. "Got my corn in by the 1st of May, one farmer would brag, leaning against a stack of seed bags. "Land prices are up another 10%, another would add, thinking of buying that quarter section north of town if the bank will go for it." Frank Gable was the king of these conversations. "Just traded the 4430 in on a new 4640, he announced one afternoon, loud enough for the whole building to hear. "Got duals on her. Figure I can work the ground twice as fast. You got to spend money to make money. He clapped Silas on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be friendly, but felt heavy with pity. "How's that old relic of yours holding up, Silas? Haven't seen you break down in the middle of the field yet this year." "She's holding up fine, Frank," Silas said quietly, refusing to meet his eye. "Well, the offer still stands. When you're ready to get serious about farming, you come see me. Maybe I can put in a good word for you down at the bank." Silas would just nod and walk away, the other men's chuckles following him out the door. They saw him as a failure, a man stuck in the past, too scared or too stupid to grab the opportunity that was right in front of him. They didn't see the nights he spent in the shop, fabricating a new part or welding a cracked bracket. They didn't see the careful ledger Martha kept at the kitchen table, where every single expense was written down in black ink, and there was never ever anything written in red. They didn't see that by the time they were paying the interest on their massive operating loans, Silas was already putting his profits in the bank. One evening in late June, a thunderstorm rolled in, a real gully washer. Silas stood on the porch, watching the rain lash down, turning his fields into a shallow lake. A flicker of lightning illuminated the horizon, and in that brief, stark flash, he saw it. A set of deep, muddy ruts cutting across Frank Gable's biggest field, a place where one of his massive new machines had gotten buried to the axles in the wet soil. Silas knew what that meant. Compaction. The heavy tractor had squeezed the life out of the soil, pressing it into a hardpan that roots would struggle to penetrate and water would never soak into. His own fields, worked with the lighter Farmall, would drink the rain up. It was a small victory, one only he would ever recognize, but it was a victory nonetheless. The years that followed were, by all accounts, the golden age. The early 1970s were good to farmers in Greene County. Russia was buying American grain by the boatload, and prices shot through the roof. Corn that had been $1 a bushel was suddenly selling for $3. Land that Silas's father had bought for $200 an acre was now worth over $1,000. The phrase on everyone's lips echoed from the Secretary of Agriculture down to the loan officer at the county bank, was fence-a-row to fence-a-row. Get big or get out. Frank Gable got big. He bought the quarter section north of town, and then the 80 acres next to that. His farm swelled to over 1,000 acres. He tore out every last fence row, bulldozing the trees and filling the ditches until his land was a featureless, efficient prairie. He built a new machine shed, a massive steel structure that dwarfed Silas's old red barn. He put up a new harvestor silo, its blue enamel a monument to his success. He traded in his 4640 for a brand new four-wheel drive John Deere 8630, a monstrous articulated beast that could pull a 12-bottom plow. He bought a new Gleaner N6 combine with an 8-row corn head. His operation was the envy of the county, a showcase of modern agricultural power. Silas and Martha watched it all from their front porch. They saw the new house Gable built for his family, a sprawling brick ranch style that sat on a hill overlooking his empire. They saw the new cars, the boat he parked in the driveway, the vacations to Florida he and his wife took every winter. Meanwhile, life on the Blackwood farm continued its steady, predictable rhythm. The good prices meant they were comfortable, but Silas didn't change a thing. He resisted the temptation to expand. He resisted the urge to buy new equipment. He saw the soaring land prices not as an opportunity, but as a danger. He saw the easy credit not as a blessing, but as a trap. Instead of taking on debt, he used the profits to pay things off. The final mortgage payment on their 160 acres was made in the fall of 1975. Silas and Martha celebrated with a simple steak dinner at home. He remembered holding the cancelled note in his hand, the paper feeling as light as a feather, but as valuable as gold. They were free. He did make a few careful investments. He bought a used International Harvester 806 from a retirement auction. It was a newer, more powerful tractor than the M, with a strong diesel engine and a wide front end, but it was still a decade old, and he paid cash for it. He used it for the heavy tillage, saving the old Farmall for planting and cultivating. He put a new steel roof on the barn and replaced the rotting posts in the cattle yard. He improved his herd of Hereford cattle, buying a top-quality bull to improve the genetics. These were small things, sensible things. They were investments in the farm he had, not gambles on a farm he might have one day. His neighbors thought he was crazy. "Silas, what are you doing?" another farmer asked him at the diner one morning. "You could leverage your quarter section, buy another 300 acres easy. You're sitting on a gold mine and treating it like a garden patch." Silas just stirred his coffee. "The way I see it, if you're sitting on a gold mine, the last thing you want to do is borrow against it." The conversation would die, the other farmers shaking their heads as they walked away. Silas Blackwood, the man who didn't understand progress, the man who was going to be left behind. He was a relic, a stubborn old fool, content to polish his antique tools while the world rushed past him. One crisp October evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, Silas was finishing up his harvest. He was using his old John Deere 6601 pull-type combine, chugging along at a slow but steady pace. Across the road, the lights of Frank Gable's massive gleaner cut through the twilight, gobbling up 8 rows at a time, its engine a distant, powerful roar. Gable would be done in another hour. It would take Silas another 2 days. He finished a pass and pulled the old IH-806 up to the edge of the field, shutting it down to let it cool. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the chirping of crickets. The air was cool and smelled of dry corn stalks and rich earth. He looked out over his field at the neat rows of golden stubble. It wasn't the biggest farm in the county. It wasn't the most profitable. But every stalk, every kernel, every square foot of dirt under his boots was his. He glanced over at Gable's operation. The sheer scale of it was breathtaking. The lights of the combine, 2 grain trucks, and a huge grain cart tractor all converged in the middle of the field, a hive of frantic, expensive activity. It was impressive, a testament to what a man could build with ambition and borrowed money. Just then, Martha came out of the house, carrying a steaming mug. She handed it to him. It was hot coffee, just the way he liked it. "Looks like Frank's almost done," she said, her voice soft. "Yep," Silas replied, sipping the coffee. "He's running hard." "The bank sent a letter today," she said, her tone changing slightly. It was just one of their newsletters, talking about the prime interest rate. Silas looked at her. "What about it?" "It's gone up again," she said, "to 12%. They said the Federal Reserve is trying to fight inflation." Silas stared across the dark fields toward the blazing lights of his neighbor's harvest. 12%. Frank Gable had millions of dollars in loans. Loans for land, for machines, for his house, for his operating expenses. All of it tied to an interest rate that was climbing like a morning glory vine. The roar of Gable's machines suddenly sounded different to Silas. It no longer sounded like power and progress. It sounded brittle. It sounded like a man running as fast as he could, not toward a finish line, but away from something that was chasing him. A dark cloud, invisible to everyone else, was gathering on the horizon. And Silas Blackwood had a sickening feeling that the golden age was about to come to a violent and sudden end. The turn of the decade felt like a page turning in a book nobody had read before. The year 1980, arrived not with a bang, but with a chilling whisper on the radio. President Carter had announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. The words, spoken by a distant voice from Washington, D.C., landed in the kitchens and pickup cabs of Greene County like stones dropped into a still pond. The biggest customer for American corn was gone, just like that. The effect was immediate and brutal. The price of corn, which had been the bedrock of the farming boom, collapsed. It fell from over $3 a bushel to barely $2, and it was still dropping. The talk at the co-op was no longer of expansion and new equipment. It was hushed, worried, and laced with a bitterness that curdled the coffee in their cups. Then the sky turned against them. The spring of 1980 was dry. The summer that followed was a scorcher, a season of brassy, cloudless skies, and a sun that felt like a physical weight on the shoulders. Day after day, the corn in the fields curled its leaves inward, a desperate, thirsty gesture. The ground, baked hard as brick, began to crack. On windy afternoons, the air filled with a brown haze as the topsoil from Frank Gable's massive, fence-row-less fields simply lifted up and blew away, a silent, creeping catastrophe. On Silas's farm, the old fence rows, thick with Osage orange and wild plum, acted as windbreaks, their roots holding the precious soil in place. His corn was suffering too, but it wasn't blowing to the next county. One sweltering afternoon in July, Silas was in his workshop, grinding the valves for the EMS engine, a task he performed every few years whether it needed it or not. He heard the unmistakable, heavy sound of a diesel engine laboring on the road and looked up. It was a service truck from the John Deere dealership. It turned slowly into Frank Gable's long driveway and rumbled up the hill toward his machine shed. An hour later, it came back down, followed by Frank in his pickup. They drove past Silas's place, heading for town. The next day, Silas saw Frank's monstrous 8630, the pride of his fleet, sitting silent in the middle of a half-plowed field. It sat there for a week, a monument to broken progress. He finally heard the story at the parts store. Frank's tractor had suffered a catastrophic failure in its complex hydraulic system. A main pump had disintegrated, sending metal shavings through every line, valve, and cylinder. The repair was a nightmare of specialized tools and weeks of labor. The bill, as the parts man whispered with a kind of morbid awe, was going to be over $15,000. A sum that could have bought Silas's entire farm 30 years ago. Silas, by contrast, had his own breakdown that summer. The clutch on his old IH-806 started to slip while he was cutting hay. He drove it back to the shed, split the tractor in two using a rolling floor jack and a set of heavy stands, and pulled the clutch assembly. The pressure plate was worn, and the disc was down to the rivets. He drove his Chevy to a tractor salvage yard, 2 counties over, found a used pressure plate in good condition for $50, and bought a new disc from an aftermarket supplier for $120. He spent 2 long, sweaty days putting it all back together, his knuckles skinned and his muscles aching. The total cost of his repair was $170 and his own labor. As he drove the 806 back out into the hayfield, its engine pulling strong, he saw the John Deere service truck finally leaving Frank's place. The bill for that one repair on that one tractor would have paid for Silas's own repairs for the next 50 years. The cracks in Frank Gable's empire were beginning to show. He was no longer the boisterous king of the co-op. He was quiet, his face etched with lines of worry. The confident grin was gone, replaced by a tight, grim set of his jaw. He'd put his herd of beef cattle, the one his father had started, up for sale. Everyone knew he didn't want to sell them. He needed the cash flow. The easy credit that had built his kingdom was becoming a gilded cage, and the bars were closing in. The bankers who had once courted him with promises of low-interest loans were now calling him about payment schedules. The golden age was over. The reckoning had begun. The crisis, when it fully hit, was not a sudden flood, but a slow, merciless drowning. The Federal Reserve, in a desperate attempt to choke the life out of inflation, jacked up the prime interest rate. The number, when it was announced on the evening news, was so high it seemed like a misprint, 21%. For men like Frank Gable, who were leveraged to the hilt with variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. The interest on his debt was now compounding faster than his crops could grow, even in a good year. And this was not a good year. The mailboxes along the rural routes of Greene County began to fill with long, white envelopes. They didn't come from friends or family. They came from banks and production credit associations. The letters inside were filled with cold, legal language, demand for payment, notice of default, intent to foreclose. The farm crisis of the 1980s had arrived. It became a season of auctions. Every Saturday, it seemed, another farm went under the hammer. Long lines of pickups would park along the gravel roads, and somber-faced men in seed corn caps would walk through the machine sheds and barns of their neighbors, quietly inspecting the tools and equipment that represented a lifetime of work, now tagged and numbered for sale. The auctioneers, men with booming voices and practiced cadences, tried to keep the mood light. But it was impossible. Everyone knew they were attending a funeral. They were picking over the bones of a failed dream, and they all wondered whose dream would be next. Silas and Martha survived. They were not thriving, but they were solvent. Their life became a study in conservation. Martha's vegetable garden was bigger than ever, and the shelves in their cellar groaned under the weight of hundreds of canning jars. Silas parked the bigger 806 diesel in the shed and started using the old Farmall M for almost everything. It burned less fuel, and he could fix anything that went wrong with it using parts from his coffee cans or fabricating them himself in the shop. He welded, he patched, he made do. The farm's income had been cut in half, but because they had no debt, their expenses were a fraction of their neighbors'. They paid their property taxes, bought their groceries, and put a little bit away. They were an island of black ink in a sea of red. The day Frank Gable's auction notice appeared in the paper, a profound sadness settled over the county. It was the end of an era. The biggest, the most successful, the man who had embodied the spirit of modern farming, had fallen. Silas went to the auction. He didn't go to gloat or to look for bargains. He went because he felt he had to bear witness. He parked his old Chevy at the end of a long line of trucks and walked up the long gravel drive to the house he had watched being built. The yard was filled with people. He saw Frank standing near the house with his wife, both of them looking a decade older than they had a year ago. Frank's eyes were hollow, his big shoulders slumped in defeat. He saw Silas and gave a short, bitter nod. The auctioneer started with the small items from the workshop: wrenches, socket sets, power tools. The intimate, everyday implements of a farmer's life were held up and sold off one by one. Then he moved to the larger equipment, lined up in the field like a parade of broken promises. The massive Gleaner N6 combine, which had cost over $100,000 just a few years before, sold for $30,000. The four-wheel drive John Deere 8630, its hydraulics now perfectly repaired, sold for less than half what Frank had paid for it. The bank was buying most of it back, trying to recoup some of its catastrophic losses. Silas watched it all, a knot in his stomach. This wasn't a victory. It was a tragedy. It was a waste of a good man's life, a life spent chasing a dream that had been sold to him by bankers and salesmen, and a government that had pulled the rug out from under him. He saw Chet Miller, the young parts man who had mocked him years ago. Chet was now the manager of the John Deere dealership, and there was no smirk on his face today. He looked pale and shaken, watching the value of the machines his dealership had sold evaporate into the cold autumn air. The auctioneer moved on to the last row of equipment, smaller things, a hay rake, a post-hole digger, an old grain auger. And there, sitting behind the barn, was the one thing Silas was interested in. It was an old Lincoln arc welder, a heavy, red, tombstone-shaped machine from the 1950s. It was the exact same model his father had owned. He knew it was a good one, simple and indestructible. When the welder came up, the bidding was slow. It was old technology. Most guys wanted the newer wire feed welders. The auctioneer started at $50. $50 bill, now $75. Who'll give me $75? Another farmer bid. $75, now $100. $100 bill. Silas raised his hand. I have $100. Now $1.25. Who'll give me $1.25? The other farmer shook his head. Sold, the auctioneer shouted, pointing at Silas. For $100 to the man in the denim jacket. After the auction was over, as the crowd began to disperse and the buyers went to settle their accounts, Silas walked over to Frank. He held out a hand. Frank looked at it for a moment before taking it, his own grip surprisingly weak. I'm sorry, Frank, Silas said, his voice quiet. Frank just shook his head, his eyes glistening. You were right, Silas. All this time you were right. I was a fool, a big, dumb, greedy fool. You weren't a fool, Silas said. You were just listening to the wrong people. We all were. Some of us were just too stubborn or too poor to take their advice. Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He took out 5 $20 bills and pressed them into Frank's hand. Here, he said, for the welder. Frank looked at the money, then back at Silas, his expression confused. The clerk handles the money, Silas. I know, Silas replied. But the bank's going to take all of that. This is for you, for your pocket. A man needs to have something in his pocket. A single tear traced a path through the dust on Frank Gable's cheek. He couldn't speak. He just squeezed Silas's hand, a silent acknowledgement of a kindness he never expected from the man he had once ridiculed. The years after the crisis were quiet and lean, but they were peaceful. The frantic energy was gone, replaced by a more cautious, deliberate pace of life. Land prices had fallen back to earth. Silas, with the small savings he and Martha had carefully accumulated, was able to buy the 80-acre parcel that bordered his farm to the north, the very same piece old man Hemlock had sold to Frank Gable years ago. He paid cash for it. It was good land, and with it his farm was now a full quarter section, 240 acres. It was more than enough. The community's perception of him had changed completely. He was no longer Silas the Relic, the stubborn old fool. He was Silas Blackwood, the man who had survived, the man who had been right. Younger farmers who were now trying to make a living with older, paid-for equipment started stopping by his workshop. They'd come with a broken part in their hand and a question on their lips. Mr. Blackwood, my dad said you might know how to fix the governor on an old Alice Chalmers. Silas, you got any idea where I can find a water pump for a case 930? Silas would always stop what he was doing, wipe his hands on a rag, and show them. He'd explain how to set the timing, how to weld a cracked frame, how to get another season out of a worn-out part. He never charged them a dime. He was just sharing what he knew, the way his father had shared it with him. One day, Chet Miller drove his shiny dealership pickup into Silas's yard. He got out, no longer the cocky kid, but a man with the weight of his business on his shoulders. Mr. Blackwood, he said, his tone full of a respect that had been absent a decade earlier. "We're thinking of starting to carry more parts for the older tractors. The 30 and 40 series, even the 2-cylinders. I was wondering if you'd be willing to advise me on what to stock. Nobody in the county knows this old iron better than you." Silas looked at the man who had once told him his Farmall was a museum piece. He saw the sincerity in his eyes. "I think I can help you with that, son," Silas said with a slow nod. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Silas and Martha grew old together in the white farmhouse with the green tin roof. They watched their grandchildren grow up, spending summers on the farm, learning the names of the trees and the feel of the soil. One warm summer evening, years later, Silas was in the machine shed. He was an old man now, his hair white and his movements slow, but his hands were still sure. His grandson, a boy of 16 named Jacob, was with him. The old Farmall M stood between them, its red paint now carefully touched up, its engine purring like a contented cat. They had spent the last 2 winters taking it completely apart and putting it back together, replacing every worn bearing, every leaky gasket. "All right," Silas said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Let's check the timing one more time." He showed Jacob how to feel for the compression stroke, how to find the mark on the flywheel, how to listen for the tiny click of the points opening inside the magneto. It was the same ritual he had performed by himself in this very shed, what felt like a lifetime ago. "You see, boy," Silas said, tapping the magneto housing, "this is the heart of it. It's simple. It's honest. There's no computer telling it what to do. You can understand it. You can hold it in your hand. And if you understand it, you can fix it. And if you can fix it," he paused, looking his grandson square in the eye, "then you don't have to be afraid of it breaking. That's the most important thing." Jacob nodded, his young face serious. He climbed into the old iron seat, which Silas had finally welded and repainted. He pulled the starter rod and the old tractor rumbled to life. He eased the clutch and the Farmall rolled slowly out of the shed and into the golden light of the setting sun. Silas stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame, the smell of gasoline and warm oil filling the air. He watched his grandson drive the old red tractor across the yard, the same tractor that had been his father's, the same tractor that had been his steadfast partner through good times and bad. The men at the dealership had called him a fool for keeping it. They had laughed at his 2-bottom plow and his stubborn refusal to take on debt. Now, their laughter was a distant echo, faded and meaningless. Frank Gable had lost his farm, the dealership had gone through bankruptcy and reorganization. But the old Farmall was still here, and so was he. He looked out over his fields, the corn standing tall and green, the fence rows alive with the evening songs of birds. It wasn't an empire, it wasn't the biggest or the most modern farm in Greene County. But it was his. Every last acre of it, paid for in cash, earned with sweat, and held together by a philosophy as simple and as durable as the old red tractor chugging across the yard. It wasn't about getting big or getting out. It was about knowing your limits, valuing your freedom, and understanding that the richest man isn't the one who has the most, but the one who owes the least. And in the quiet twilight of his life, Silas Blackwood knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he was a very rich man indeed.